Hey friends, now I've got a feeling today's video is going to be a little bit divisive and maybe even a little bit controversial even all these years later, because today we're going to talk about software piracy, more specifically software piracy on the Amiga. Now the reason this has been on my mind recently is because a friend of mine actually made a really cool discovery in his attic a couple of weeks ago when he found this. A classic Commodore Amiga 500, amazing machine, and as you can see I've got my A500 set up on the table behind me. The reasons will become apparent in just a moment. But this Amiga 500 belonged to my friend's dad, and he used to use it, back when the Amiga was a mainstream platform. He got a PC in the mid-90s, put that up in the attic, and kind of completely forgotten about it. Now my friend's recently been getting into retro gaming, bought a Mega Drive and a Super Nintendo, and he found this Amiga in his attic. Never used one before, didn't really know much about it, but he knew that I was into Amigas. So he said to me, would you mind having a look at it for me and see if you can get it working? Now it was in a pretty bad way. It had 20 years worth of dust and dirt, and it had gone really rusty inside. There was quite a few keys missing off the keyboard, but I managed to fix it up, get a replacement keyboard, retro brighted it, cleaned all the components, got rid of the rust inside it, removed the leaking battery from the RAM expansion, cleaned up the floppy drive heads, and actually, once I got a SCART to RGB cable, mouse and a joystick for him, it's actually in really good working order now, ready to give back to him. But before I did, I suddenly realised he hasn't got any software to use on it. So recently I've just been downloading a bunch of ADFs and writing a few famous Amiga demos and maybe a few games that he should try as an introduction to the platform. And I realised when I was writing these discs that it became really nostalgic for me. Something I hadn't done for so many years, actually, handwriting with a felt tip pen, disc labels, and using disc copiers on the Amiga. And that kind of brought back some quite, suppressed hidden memories. Because you go back to the late 80s and early 90s here in Britain, and you might be like me, you maybe got an Amiga for Christmas. I got my Amiga 500 Plus for Christmas 1991. And then, within a few months, I noticed that loads of kids at school ended up getting Amigas, whether it was 500s, 600s, or 1200s. And there turned out to be a really big piracy scene in my school playground. And I know this was commonplace at loads of schools here in Britain back in that era. I mean, it started really on the Commodore 64 with the, deck-to-deck copying of cassette tapes. You could do that really easily. And then, it almost became like trading cards at my school, I remember. There'd be kids who would have, massive collections of Amiga copied games. They wouldn't even play them. It'd just be, the cool thing to have this week's hottest new game. And if you went back then, you'd walk into a game shop and you would often see, shelves full of big box Amiga games like this that always looked amazing to me. If you walked into your local independent game shop or somewhere like Future Zone when that opened, just seeing these big box games for Amigas and Atari STs and PCs used to look like this as well, PC games. It always really fascinated me, and the price of them was normally around 25 quid. And I would always get, proper Amiga box games for birthdays and Christmas off my parents and relatives, and I used to cherish them so much because it felt like you're getting a quality product here. You've got these really substantial, heavy cardboard boxes in full colour. You've also got all the screenshots on the back there as well. And, on Christmas morning when you open the shrink wrap and you got inside the box and, it smells a bit fusty now, but back in the day it used to be a freshly printed manual and discs, hot off the factory press. It was a quality product, and you knew that your parents had worked really hard and it was expensive, so you'd really cherish and take care of your proper box games. But when you had copied games and stuff, generally you just write over the disc when you got bored of a game a couple of weeks later with whatever was new. So it was always much better to get the original games, and it was kind of an ethic in the piracy scene that if you liked a copied game, you would reward the company by going out and buying the original. That was always encouraged. And of course I did say they were 25 quid. And I do remember reading at the time a big excuse for piracy on the Amiga was people said games were overpriced. Whereas in hindsight, I had friends who had Mega Drives and Super Nintendos, and on the consoles, new games were 40 to 60 quid. And you're talking in 1992 money here. So in comparison, Amiga games were actually a lot more affordable. And there were ways to get cheaper Amiga games. For example, here we've got a budget re-release. Now, if you didn't mind playing games that were a year or two old, they'd often re-release them in these smaller boxes. Maybe a different company would put them out there, and they'd have just a single sheet of paper manual inside and the disc, and that was about it. But they'd often sell these for about $9.99, or in this case, this was actually $2.99 pre-owned. So there was actually quite a lot of ways to get affordable Amiga games. But that said, back at my school, most kids' game collections looked like this. So you could walk into a shop like Ryman's or your local game shop, get a box of 10 double-sided double-density floppy disks for about £6, I think it used to cost back then, and then you'd need the labels as well. And they used to come in two different forms. You'd either get a sheet of labels like this, that I bet has probably lost all of its stickiness by now, or in my local game shop Chips, they would actually have a roll of disc labels under the counter. They'd sell them for a penny each, and you'd say, I want 50 disc labels. They'd just pull them off, rip them off, there you go, 50p. So getting hold of blank discs was really easy. And I mean, for me, it wasn't just about games and stuff. I also was quite into public domain, and I was into, making my own workbench discs and that kind of thing. So having a lot of blank floppy disks around was very handy. Now, someone recently asked me what I think is the most popular program that was ever used on the Amiga. And that got me thinking. I was kind of like, oh, that's a tough one. Maybe Workbench, or maybe something like D-Paint. That was included in pretty much every Amiga box for years. And then I thought, actually, I know what it probably was. And I bet it was this program here, Xcopy Pro. Get the disc the right way up. As everybody I knew had a copy or two of Xcopy. And usually you'd find these on what they used to call utils discs. So like this here, it'd have loads of different stuff on them. You'd often get 20 or 30 programs on them. Maybe a couple of copiers, usually be a mod player on there as well, maybe a hex editor, and they'd always have a phone number on the ASCII intro screen of a guy in Middlesbrough or Stoke-on-Trent or somewhere random. You never did call the number because he always sounded a little bit dodgy. But pretty much everyone I knew had a big collection of utils discs with loads of different copiers on there. Now, Xcopy originally was sold as a commercial product, boxed by a company called Cache, and like a lot of these products, they're actually marketed as being backup solutions, so you could back up your original games, so in case the original disc got damaged, you wouldn't have to go out and buy a replacement. However, most people actually use them for, backing up other people's software. That was really the main use of Xcopy from what I saw. But there was lots of different programs. I remember Dcopy, there was Tetracopy that would actually give you a game of Tetris while you were copying discs. And there's even one, that I remember was very, very blatant about what people used it for. I think it was called Nibblecopy, and it would play quite an interesting tune while it was copying your discs.
Yo ho, a pirate's life for me. Yo ho, a pirate's life for me.
So yeah, not very subtle there really, was it? So I just thought in this video we kind of look a little bit at Xcopy because it was such a major system seller on the Amiga. So many people probably bought them just because they could get an easy collection of discs off their friends. And I actually did a speech at the Amiga 30 event in Amsterdam, which you can see the poster behind me there, and at the Amiga 30 event in Peterborough a couple of years ago, when we're just talking about memories of the Amiga, what it meant to me, and also I showed a little video with a few screenshots of famous Amiga programs, and Xcopy was the only program that got a round of applause from the audience at both events. And bizarrely, despite the fact that it was so prevalent, I've done a bit of Googling before making this video, and actually there's not that much material online about Xcopy. No real articles, no kind of in-depth videos like this, despite the fact that everyone had it in their disc collection really. No one really talks about it. So I thought it would be quite nice to kind of, do this as a little tribute to Xcopy. But I did find one website that's definitely worth a look. A guy's actually got together all of the official releases of Xcopy and tried to archive them so you can actually download them and see all the different releases and also the release notes and what the error codes and all that kind of thing meant. So the website is a tribute to Xcopy, and it is worth a look because there were so many different versions of Xcopy, usually hacked by the pirates, which, considering the audience that used it, that's not a big surprise. I remember I had a Christmas edition where it would snow and play Jingle Bells while it was copying discs. I had a CD TV version with slightly different fonts. But if you want to see the official releases, I'll put a link to that in the video description. What I thought we'd do now is kind of go back to 1992, get the Amiga 500 fired up, and do an old school Xcopy session like we used to back in the day. Okay, so here we have a pretty common sight in bedrooms, in living rooms and studies and offices all over the UK and Europe back in the late 80s and early 90s. A classic Amiga 500 setup, hooked up to a 14-inch CRT monitor. This is actually my original monitor that I got when I was a kid, still in great working order and definitely my preferred way to experience the Amiga 500. Really nostalgic using a proper CRT. But in fact, if you had this exact setup back in the day, you would have been, quite a posh kid, because I've actually got an A590 external hard disk on the end of my system there. And they were really expensive back then. That came originally with a 20 megabyte hard disk, and it cost £399. The same price that the Amiga itself cost. So that, I didn't have one of those when I was a kid. That is a recent acquisition, but I've actually upgraded it with a bigger hard disk, and as you can hear, it is very, very noisy. So excuse me if you can hear that in the background, but I may do a separate video on the A590 hard disk because it is quite an interesting product. But as you can see here, we're booting into the Amiga's workbench, and this system would have been a very good setup for doing disk copying. In fact, a pretty typical one, because we've got the internal Amiga drive here, and also there is an external floppy drive at the end too. Now that meant you could copy disks and you wouldn't have to kind of, keep swapping them in the internal drive. So I've got Xcopy here, so we'll put that in the internal drive, give the Amiga a reboot, and I've got a blank disk here that we'll use in the external drive. And again, I've got a couple of other utilities disks that were quite common back then. One of them here is called the Man's Utility Disk. This one is called Wizard's Disk. And they always had like kind of cool names like that, like this one here. This is called, the copy disk compiled by Spike. Now, when I was a kid, you'd often think of names like, Wizard and Spike, and you think these guys were like, proper elite hackers. Probably looked a bit like, the kids in the movie Hackers, wore shades all day and used to travel around on skateboards and that kind of thing. Whereas in reality, they were probably like, spotty teenage nerds like me. So you can select from the menu here. I've selected D copy there. You type in number 17 like it says in the menu, and there is a typical Amiga disk copy user interface. Now on the screen here you can see the two separate sides of the floppy disk, head 0 and head 1, because these were double-sided disks that you usually used on the Amiga, and your target and source disk drives here as well. Now dcopy was quite popular program, but really Xcopy was the main one that people used, just because dcopy wasn't quite as good at bypassing many of the protection that were on the disks. So Xcopy 3, which I think was one of the most popular versions, so we'll just load that from this disk here. And as I mentioned, I'm using a CRT monitor, so excuse any flicker that you might get. And this will be a screen that will be very nostalgic to many people in the Amiga community. This was the one that got a round of applause when I showed it at the Amiga 30 events. Now the way you use Xcopy is very simple really. I mean, you get again the upper side and the lower side of the target disk and source disk in here, and you also get a list of your floppy disk drives here. Now as you can see, because we've got two disk drives on this Amiga, it's automatically selected DF0, the internal drive, with a light bulb to be the source, and DF1, the external drive, with a light bulb to be the target. So that would mean you don't have to swap disks. Now if I press start here, I've got a really noisy floppy drive on my Amiga 500, and actually for me that is a good thing, because my original A500 that I had as a kid also had a really loud floppy drive. I'm not a fan of the really whisper quiet ones that you get in the later Amigas. To me, a proper Amiga floppy disk drive should, vibrate the table and shake the walls. So I like my really loud drive in this. But as you can see, it is now reading in the contents of the disk. And because this Amiga 500 has got expanded memory, I've actually got 4 megabytes in here, it should be able to read the entire contents of the disk into RAM without needing to do 2 passes over it. So you always wanted to see that as well. When you got a 0, that meant that it was reading the contents of the track into memory just fine. It's when you got something like a red, I love that noise, a red number 1, that would mean that there was a problem. So now if we click start again, it should continue, and now it is writing the contents of the RAM onto the external floppy drive. So as you can see, it's going fine here, no errors so far, and really it was that easy. I mean, if you had one internal disk drive, you just have to swap disks at the end of that process there. But I remember watching, videos of Amiga copy parties and scene demo parties, and that kind of, boing noise that Xcopy makes at the end, you would hear that going off at Amiga parties pretty much every 20 seconds back in the early 90s. So many people used to, practically live on this program. And, it is something that is part of the Amiga culture, and it kind of went hand in hand with the demo scene, really. And it was a legendary program, so I thought just, showing this in operation might be quite nostalgic for a lot of people, even if they may not want to admit it. So that was a typical Xcopy copy session there. Here we go. Oh, that noise. So thank you for checking out this video. If you've got any memories of those days, maybe you had a favourite copy program on the Amiga, maybe you used some tools to maybe hex edit discs or maybe even crack copy protection. I'm always interested in finding out stories of that era. And actually, if you are interested in Amiga piracy, we did a special on the Retro Hour podcast with Galahad, who used to work for some very famous Amiga piracy groups back in the day. Again, I'm not aiming to glamorise piracy. I understand that, people have got to earn a living off software sales, and, as an adult, I completely get that now, but it was part of the culture of, these machines. So I think it's important to document it. So I'll put a link to that episode of our podcast in this video description. And please do leave a comment if you've got any memories to share. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.